The support of the Patreon has really made a difference and provided a model to produce free speech without censorship. I want to thank you guys again for your support. So I hope it's prudent to do this video already, but I think it's important that we address this stuff. But especially if we're going to unite these schools of thought, it's going to be good to take a clear look at both of them. And I really quickly wanted to show this picture of an upside down house with a water droplet in front of it. And the water droplet's in focus, but you can see through the water droplet. And in the reflection is a perfect, albeit upside down, little world. And this ability to curve and capture light is an interesting capacity of water. And that's both something very cool and something that you can understand and can be explained through math and empirical science. And scientists like math, so we're going to be talking a little bit about science and about some equations from Heisenberg and Schrodinger. You might say, well, you don't see the value of mathematics or the application of abstract metrics on empirical observations, and may believe they conflict with your approach to experiencing your reality, and so you'd rather disregard it. But then you'll never be able to get them to see things your way, and there's less of a barrier of philosophy as there is of language and semantics of experience. And refusing to hear each other's points of view means neither's gets heard. And so their hubris might seem rigid in spectrum and pompous and even absurd. But it's important to remember that their intentions are good and that they sit at the same table between a window as if it were a mirror. And that also their didacticism and yours are the ironic consequence, perhaps, of following a misunderstanding to the letter of the law. And it's important to take that into consideration, because so often in fighting the things that we hate, we become them. So it's always good to throw away the conceptions that we have about each other's faults so that we can look for the truth that each other are latching onto. And I have a movie recommendation. It's called A Serious Man, a Coen film, and it's a contemporary parable to the story of Job, only it's about a mathematician and professor who believes in the chaos theory. And it sort of stars math as God in this sort of rigorous deus ex machina as he clings on to his devotion and loyalty to the chaos theory. And the professor's a very serious man and doesn't have any time for nonsense. But for the most part, he has everything he needs. He has the math. The math is all he needs, and it's there like the law, in stone slate. And as a scientist, it's a rule book, and it sort of provides a script, a gameplay, which he can use to extrapolate pragmatic solutions that he can solve problems in his life with. But of all the theories that he holds to be serious, the one that occupies his mind the most is the theory of chaos, which states with no lack of resolution and utter clarity, which mathematically proves we can definitively conclude that we can never know what's going on, that everything about the universe is very nebulous, and that we can only perceive about 1% of reality, but there has to be 99 times as much of it, and there must be way, way more of it, or else the lack of density, according to our physics, due to our temporary conceptions of astrophysics, would incapacitate these celestial satellites from maintaining their spherical shape. And that would just be crazy, right? That would just be nebulous. And it just seems impossible from what we understand about dark matter. I mean dark matter. I mean dark matter. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, this is a picture of dark matter. Definitely a photo of dark matter. But this alleged dark matter, which you only hear about the dark matter, by the way, the majority shareholder of this equation is dark energy, allegedly making up nearly 70% of the contents of our universe. So it's really all about dark energy. But looking at our chunk of reality, and from our understanding of wave physics, it is a hypothesis about dark matter that there may be other spectrums of interaction between dark matter and dark energy, and we are experiencing a very specific frequency that makes our particular reality possible. And it might lead one to speculate that if this is one radio station, there is another, or perhaps an entire series, or perhaps an entire set of stations. And though the rest of reality is described as either junk or dark or just empty space, an inside-out vacuum, let me remind you of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which using actual metrics from measurements of photons, not just in academic papers and pipe dreams, that you can see an instant or you can see a trend, but you can't see both. And either way, when you're looking at it, the universe is striking a pose. But it's never holding still, ever. It's always moving. And what I mean by that is there is no instant, or perhaps there is only one. And this was proven by Schrodinger, or rather by his cat. And if you're skeptical and you're worried that I'm going to tell you that an old man named Schrodinger unlocked the secrets of the universe with a box with a cat in it, and you're asking yourself and me if I'm serious? Yeah, I'm totally serious, because what Schrodinger did was he took, and by the way, don't try this at home, a box with a radioactive material and a hammer and a poison and a Geiger counter. However, recent work from the University of Vienna regarding the quantum states of subatomic particles, the quantum states of matter, to unveil the secrets of topology, and physicists have concluded that the density of space can mathematically be described as depth within the equations of quantum relativity, and with something physicists and mathematicians describe as space-time foam or quantum foam, which the universe is comprised of predominantly and is constantly expanding and contrasting like the seas. And the working model for this quantum relative universe, or flat space as it's described by physicists, connected in one long flat twisting plane in an inconceivably long strand that is infinite because it is joined at either side, and our experienced reality can be described as a mathematical illusion which we perceive from the spectral depth of flat space. And if you haven't heard that space is flat, you might be saying to yourself, when did this happen to space science? That they decided the universe was some sort of a hologram? I mean, even a hologram, okay, I've heard something like that, but flat, right? No scientist believes the universe is flat, do they? Like, that's crazy, right? Like some sort of a giant string theory? Because that would just be insane. But there's some solid math that's pretty well accepted, and often championed by physicists such as Gerard de Hooft, Nobel Prize winner, and Dutch physicist. And there's a lot riding on string theory in flat space, because without it, a lot of very expensive science experiments would collapse. In a sense, everything's riding on it. So in case you get too wound up about string theory and flat space, just remember you've already heard about it all your life in school, especially if you stuck around, and from everybody's favorite, most distinguished professors, such as Leonard Susskind from Stanford and Cornell. And he's even got a bunch of videos on YouTube about entanglement and flat space. But if you open another window and play some sitar music behind it while you watch, it's pretty bearable. However, unless you really like math, it's probably easier just to watch the experiments being done in phys.org, because it's not just math. It actually is just a bunch of giant tools measuring stuff. And luckily, I've had some experience with AFMs and TEMs and SEMs, atomic force microscopes, transmission electron microscopes, scanning electron microscopes, and they all kind of work slightly similarly. They all work kind of differently at the same time, because they're trying to read bombarding and reactions off of an object in order to tell various things about them. I've actually used a couple of these things. This is a TEM, this is a TEM, transmission electron microscope, and this is a pretty small one actually. They get pretty big. The one at Stanford is about 20 feet tall. There's a whole building built around it, and it's on top of a giant stone altar to keep it from moving, so that the building actually is not attached. It's just walls around a flat piece of stone. I think it's marble or it's granite. And then on top of the granite stone is the microscope, and then around it is the walls, and then the walls have rooms, and then there's a roof over that, and this is in order to keep the machine from moving. But it tells amazing things. You get a lot of information from it, and you can see, the intricacies of stoichiometric properties of particles. It's a great way to measure what is in something and how much of something is in it, and the bonds between them. It's not just a bunch of math. It's real life. And I think it's a totally reasonable field of study, and so is chemistry. And chemistry might be actually the most reasonable scientific study, and one of the oldest, because it can be conducted through the observations and deductions of experimentation and the scientific method. And that's actually where we get our word for experts, experimentation, from experience. And if you're going to look into open educational resources about chemistry, a sociably acceptable place as any to start is Open Yale courses, and they have a great system. And you might be surprised how much you like the chemistry lectures with Michael McBride, despite what you think about science and math. Because even if you think there's nothing else to glean from physics and math and all these ideas from flat space and string theory, the one quote I want you to take away from Open Yale's chemistry lectures with Michael McBride is that science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And might I paraphrase by saying the skepticism of gnosis and others' experiences. Because there is some sort of sense of stability to be found in studying the law. Great is the law. Solid is the law. Never mind that perfection is abstract, because their forms are metaphor for the more analog particles and waves that make up our universe. And that's why Heisenberg described uncertainty as a principle and not a paradox, because physics is all very meta. Because even if things are all jumbled, clearly the math exists and often works, and does work as a rule. And regardless of the lack of straight lines, curves, or angles, the forms are always there. So you have to believe in them. So then math and physics and hypotheses all become this faith in meta and science, and sort of a unifying dichotomy, really, that has to exist because you need to test all things and you need to prove them. But you also need to have a hypothesis, and that's a conviction and a faith and a belief in something. That might not be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but it's what you know and it's the best you got. And our perceptions and our beliefs might change over time, and in fact they must. But the point is nothing really changes because it's always the same thing. Always reaching for the truth. Always trying to grasp it. And often it cannot be grasped because the truth is a product of the shared parts, or the milieu as it's called in French. And the milieu is a philosophical concept to describe the biosphere or ecosystems or the family or a city. It's a profoundly useful thing. And even a church or a community or a group online can be a milieu. And the philosophy really comes from that sort of a tradition, and was really introduced to mainstream society by a Jesuit priest named Pierre Teilhard Chardin. And don't get too worked up about that, because Chardin was definitely on the outskirts with the Jesuits, and they tried to have him excommunicated, and they silenced him for years. So keep that in mind about Chardin, and also just read some of his stuff. And if it doesn't sit right with you, you can just toss it to the side. That's probably the right thing to do. But I ask, if you were a kid in 19th century France who liked to play with rocks and wanted to study geography and geology and physics and went to a good Jesuit school because that was the only school available to you and you wanted to continue, and you were interested in the things you are now and you wanted to study them, you might have found yourself in his same shoes and collar, or else likely you wouldn't have been able to study these things at all. And despite all that, and being threatened and silenced, he still decided to hold fast to what he believed, and he wrote some things down, which were not to be shared with public, but eventually were smuggled out by Aldous Huxley's brother Julian. And one time Teilhard Chardin said, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience." And both spiritualists and physicists all ask you to find the lie. But the Catholic Church doesn't need to find the lie, they can just do what they want, so they tried to have him excommunicated. Only they couldn't have him excommunicated because all he really did was teach some physics in Cairo. So they decided on banishment, and they sent him away to China, where he ended up in Peking. And when you know it, he found something in Peking. And you might think this was planted by the Jesuits, but considering how antithetical this was at the time to their entire narrative, most of the things that we're discovering in prehistory would go against most of everything that they're trying to force upon us. I kinda doubt that the Jesuits planted the Peking Man. And oh yeah, that's what Chardin found. Teilhard Chardin found the Peking Man, which at the time was actually a pretty big deal because the Peking Man was an early discovery before just about any evidence of simultaneous hominids to the human species. And so it was basically pawned off as another kind of caveman, as some sort of genetic ancestor to the human, inferior in literally any conceivable way. And the obvious appearance of strength is done away with is explained away as sheer excessiveness by the archaeologists. And I propose this is the status quo's contribution to the narrative. The mythos that these giants are our predecessors and that we are some sort of refined apex, penultimate achievement from these otherwise from our bulbous and clumsy predecessors. But these monsters are regulated to the archives of history and clearly do not affect us anymore. Certainly do not walk amongst us. I mean, it would be completely absurd to suggest that there were bipedal, fur-covered hominids were living quietly somewhere or all over, hiding and being hid across the planet in state parks and nature preserves. It would just seem not quite absurd or unbelievable, but paradoxical, in fact, to what we are taught. Simply, that is all. Just literally the exact opposite of everything that we are taught. No more, no less. However, I digress. After discovery of the Peking Man, Teilhard Chardin, who had already offended and upset the status quo and had been exiled to the mudflood digs of Tartarian China, was then immediately silenced again and then confined for the rest of his life in a church in New York, where he predominantly wrote poetry and played basketball and performed exorcisms until he died. And, by the way, if you get the feeling that I'm alluding to the idea that the exorcist priest from the movie The Exorcist is Teilhard Chardin, I'm totally doing that, because I think that's what they're doing too. However, this is another reason why I ask you to prepare yourself to look deeper into Chardin before you decide to judge him, because I get the feeling that there's more than meets the eye about this guy, and that he might have found something he wasn't supposed to find, but he understood it better than anyone else has, at least until the last 20 years. But after this long and rather secretive legacy, eventually his works did get released to the public, and except for the really deep thinkers, it was kind of brushed over because not a lot of people got it. And maybe it was a lot to do with the prejudice, because at this point he was a complete freak to both the Jesuits, the Catholic Church, the normal people, and the atheist scientists. And you'd be surprised how small of a support network there was, let alone a demographic, for silenced Jesuit priests. But there's a scene for everything, and Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, forwarded and helped publish Teilhard Chardin's Phenomenon of Man, the human phenomenon, because in French it's really the human phenomenon. And that's a big thing about Chardin, and one of the things I like about him the most is that he uses words, but he describes them differently. So he has to redefine all these words. But it's usually because there's just a completely different interpretation of the word that actually makes sense, instead of the one that doesn't make sense, which both you and him have thrown away. Only he threw it away first, and he's already come up with something that makes way more sense than that. And one of Teilhard Chardin's trippiest things is his description of evolution, because he describes a completely different evolution than the one that doesn't make sense, because it's a completely other kind of evolution than the bastardized Darwinianism that we're taught in schools, which I don't really want to go into right now because I think most people understand the differences between mutations and evolution. And so spiritual creationists know that there is such a thing as mutations. This is not something that's bizarre or shocking to them, as atheists will often believe. And in fact, it seems like an absurd thing to argue with faith-based believers because for one thing, your conviction ought to be something that's more than an opinion that can be broken from a YouTube video. But I want to offer the same service to atheists if they believe in exactly the same amount of faith, or perhaps more, in some sort of a missing link, or the knots that interlink the missing links that make possible this great exchange from mutations of mucus into completely different, diverse, intricate species. And of course now we know about DNA, but because DNA was not something that could be studied at the time, it was only something recently cracked by some UCSC students with some power books. So a long time it was just assumed that there was some sort of a high order of architecture for the universe. But this was being deduced from top-down observation. So interestingly, perhaps in opposition to Darwinianism, Chardin offered a completely different philosophy about our spiritual evolution. And it's based in at least as much science as Darwinism, and in fact, probably a lot more. And it's the concept of an actual evolution from spirit into mind, and the milieu that's formed between the mind, culture, and human society based on its relationships to the other spheres, from the biosphere to the geosphere to the cosmos. And the biosphere includes all life, and the geosphere includes all matter, but the cosmos includes the metaphysics of subatomic particles and astrophysics. But through this matter, the mind, body, and soul are connected through the spirit, which unifies the other four realms of reality, which unify the other four forms. And though the Noosphere, which gets its name from the word for mind in Greek, this philosophy might seem vaporous and lacking in physics, it's not. It's actually very much physical. Chardin might be considered a 20th century St. Thomas Aquinas for his works in reuniting the empirical physics, reuniting the physical experience with the interpretations of biblical texts. Because beyond Teilhard Chardin's pioneering research in psychic evolution and metaphysics, his research in geology led to the understanding of sacred mechanics, orderly mechanics, divine mechanics, godly mechanics, where atoms don't just socialize in order to become rocks, they become precious stones, and even diamonds. And there's not a lot of difference between a carbonic piece of graphite and a carbonic diamond, except for literally the ordered symmetry of the socialization of the stardust, literally the socialization of the atoms. And Chardin actually realized this first as a child. When he first decided he wanted to go to school to become a priest, it was because he was interested in geology, and he wanted to understand how exactly diamonds, and more importantly to him, jade formed. Because it seemed just so crazy, just so incredible, and perhaps unbelievable that atoms would socialize in this nebulous space and form these geodes, let alone that these geospheres would organize themselves into biospheres of living acids, of living systems, because atoms socialize in order to worship, and that is to say, to reciprocate for their existence by producing a worthy gift. And while you might say that's awfully close to Madame Blavatsky's theory on spiritual evolution and consciousness, I might tend to agree, but I might also tend to see the differences and note that a lot of lies are about the truth, and which one seems more true to you? And I'd have to say that my vote goes for Teilhard de Chardin over Madame Blavatsky, because while I think both of them are talking about something true, I'm pretty sure that only one of them really sees this shared theos as a divine milieu. So until he becomes really mainstream and they start pushing him down our throats, I'm going to say Teilhard de Chardin's my favorite silenced Jesuit, at least in the top 10 of the 20th century. The support of the Patreon has really made a difference. It provided a model to produce free speech without censorship. I want to thank you guys again for your support.